Hello and welcome to the video analysis of the game Janovski Capablanca. We will look at this game from the very beginning because the game enters an endgame very quickly, as early as move 6. So we can start with the very first moves of this, I would say also famous game by Capablanca, quoted in many books on chess endgames, and one that has been analyzed quite a lot, but I think that analyzing it myself, I managed to discover some depths that at least I couldn't find in other sources. So I hope I'll be able to convey the richness and the depth of this game that is, well, again, one of Capablanca's more famous ones. So after d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, c6, knight c3, we see Capablanca use the Slav defense in this game. But now he makes a move that modern theory considers as an inaccurate one. He plays the move bishop f5. Now, modern theory has established that if black wants to play bishop f5, he first needs to release the tension in the center by taking on c4, and only after a4 he can play bishop f5. And this is the one of the main lines of the Slav defense. By playing immediately bishop f5, Capablanca allows his opponent to take advantage of the move order by taking on d5 first. So after bishop f5, what today's theory considers best that white should take c takes d5. And after c takes d5, of course, not knight d5 because that would allow white a full center. So c takes d5, queen b3. Now the point is that compared to the game, black cannot play the same move queen b6 because then white could either take on b6 and use the b5 square for the knight, or he can simply take the pawn with knight d5. Therefore, after queen b3, black's best is bishop c8, but then we see that black actually wasted two moves, bishop f5, bishop c8. And then later on he will be forced to play e6, and then he will have a rather inferior and a couple of tempi down version of the exchange variation in the Slav defense. But well, it's hard to say why Capablanca played bishop f5, whether he was careless or not. There are many myths, and some of them maybe they are true to a certain point, that he wasn't never really strong in the openings. He never really cared that much about the opening. So maybe this was just carelessness on his part, allowing his opponent to put immediate pressure on him. But luckily for him, Janovski missed this chance and played queen b3 first. And now queen b6, defending the pawn on b7 is possible because, as we shall see after the exchange of queens and taking on d5, black will be able to take with the knight, eliminating that knight on c3 and not allowing that jump knight b5. So Janovski actually did exchange the queens, even though modern theory suggests that c5 actually is a better attempt here for white, gaining space on the queen side. And in case, for example, queen takes b3, a takes b3, white has the very straightforward plan of advancing b4, b5 and obtaining initiative on the queen side. But Janovski misses the second chance for an advantage in the opening, and after queen takes b6, a takes b6, this is already an acceptable endgame for black, because after c takes d5, knight takes d5 is the key difference. Of course, not c d5, because that would allow something like knight b5, which the knight is quite strong on b5, threatening knight c7, but rather knight takes d5, forcing the exchange of knights. So after knight takes d5, c d5, and now we have the starting point of this endgame. Now, what again is impressive from the aspect of how the game develops is again the ability that Capablanca showed of outplaying again an elite player from this seemingly, you could call it, very equal endgame. You could even argue that white even maybe has the slightly better endgame because his pawn structure is not disrupted in any way, whereas black has doubled pawns on the b file. But then if we look at these doubled pawns, we all know the theoretical guideline to avoid them because they are weak. But then again, if this weakness cannot be taken advantage of, then that weakness only remains theoretical and not practical. And chess is all about being practical, what you can use, what you can take advantage of. And here we see that these pawns whose weakness consists of the weakness of the square in front of them, the pawn, the square b5, it's not that easy to take advantage of this theoretical weakness, because with the absence of the knight from c3, the only piece that controls that square on b5 is the light squared bishop on f1. But that bishop alone cannot do much. Yes, it can land on b5, but most likely it will be exchanged there, and white cannot really take advantage of those doubled pawns. On the other hand, black obtains some extra possibilities in this position thanks to these doubled pawns. If you look at it, he has the open a file, so his rook on a8 is already developed in a way without moving, because it's very active on the a file. And also we will see later on the other possibility that these doubled pawns offers black, and that is an expansion on the queen side, namely the possibility of advancing the pawn to b5 and then landing a knight to c4 via c6 and a5. So let's see how the game progresses. This is the evaluation of the position. Objectively, yes, it's equal, but word of advice, if you will, it's not of great help if during a game you say, okay, this is equal, I'm better, he's better, or whatever. This doesn't really help because it doesn't tell you anything about the position. It is much better to approach a position's evaluation by speaking about concrete things that are happening in the position. So who cares who's better? Look at the plans. Look at which side what they can do. Okay, what are their plans? What are their options? Who has the easier game? Who needs to defend? Who needs to attack? All these things are much more valuable when you are thinking about a position, rather than retelling yourself something like I'm better here, or he's better here, or whatever, something abstract. So again, we said yes, it's equal, but the plans are important, how the game should continue from this moment. So already the next move by Janovsky, like I said, a very strong player. He played the World Championship match with Lasker 6 years prior to this game. So an elite player himself. He plays a very strange move. He plays the move e3. I say strange because the move voluntarily shuts that bishop on c1. When instead he could have developed that bishop on the more active square on f4. But nothing wrong with the move. Nothing wrong with the move. Of course, it's a normal move. It has the benefit of immediately taking advantage of that square on b5. But please, from this moment already, start noticing the somewhat different quality of the moves by each player. Okay, I will try to pinpoint this as we go, but notice how one player will be playing incisive moves with concrete and clear ideas, and the other player will be playing normal moves, but moves that are somewhat passive and without clear, let's call them forward thinking ideas. And by forward thinking, I mean non-defensive. Moves that try to do something. So let's say, continue. E3, knight c6, normal developing move, developing the knight. Bishop d2. Janovsky develops the bishop and controls the b4 square in the process. So b4 and a5 also. And now we come to this position, which is again a very famous one. If you know this game, you know this position as well, because it is the position where Capablanca plays one of his most famous moves of his career. So okay, if you know it, then you just know it. If you don't know it, then maybe you can pause and think about like what you would do here with black, what move you would play, and just think about the position and like how you would approach it. So Capablanca in this position played the move bishop d7. And again, it's a shocking move because it just appeared the bishop was doing great on f5, being active on the b1 h7 diagonal. And then what happens is that black voluntarily brings it back, so he wastes a tempo playing with an developed piece already, which we know is not what is normally recommended. And then he will even shut it in on d7 by playing e6, so making it a bad bishop theoretically. As I mentioned, on the surface this makes very little sense. Okay, this is like what a beginner would be told off by the coach, like, what are you doing? You have a developed piece. Why are you playing with the developed piece twice to make it worse and make it a bad piece then? Yeah. But of course, great players rise above these considerations. Yeah. And here we see actually that Capablanca's move is based on a clarity and very strong logic. Yeah. So if you remember when I was talking about the double pawns, the extra possibility they give to black, I said that pawn on b6 wants to come to b5 to control the c4 square, and then the knight from c6 via a5 can land on c4. So this is black's clear and natural plan of play on the queen side. Now, in order to achieve that plan, he needs control over the b5 square. Yeah? And there is just one piece that can control that square to allow for the b5 push, and that is the light squared bishop. And now when you think in this way, all of a sudden Capablanca's move is natural, it's normal, not shocking anymore. It's just, yeah, but of course, yeah, okay, I have this plan of knight a5, b5, knight c4. In order to achieve b5, I need the bishop on d7 to support that pawn, and that's clear, that's natural. Yeah. So this concrete thinking, yeah, and also clear thinking of what needs to be done was always present in Capablanca's games, and that's what I think makes them so of such a great instructional value, because chess is, after all, a game of logic. Yeah? And if you follow the logic, if you have this clarity of what needs to be done, you can play moves that at first sight appear shocking or breaking all rules, but then on the other hand, digging a little bit more under the surface, the true beauty of that logic is shown. So we have bishop d7 in this position, one of the, like I said, most famous moves by Capablanca. And now white continued with bishop e2. Again, normal move, nothing wrong with it, but again, it just gives this impression of being suboptimal. Yeah, I mean, white's position is extremely solid, no weaknesses, very solid, no problems. Yeah, but making these suboptimal moves, it kind of accumulates. Yeah, and suboptimal moves, little by little, lead to slight unpleasant problems. And if they are tolerated, they lead to more problems. And this is like a snowballing effect that very often happens in positions that are, let's say, equal. But when one side plays moves that are of higher quality than the opponent. And here we have a clear case of that. Black plays in this clear-cut, logical way. White makes normal moves, but it's clear that the quality of black's moves is higher than those of white. And this, as you will see, will lead to certain problems to white, for white in the next few moves. Of course, it was possible to play bishop b5 immediately, to put the bishop on the b5 square and stop, in a way, black's plan, but this is only on the surface. In fact, bishop b5 will not stop black's plan. It will only lead to the exchange of the light squared bishops. So, for example, an illustrative line is f6 first, to take control over the e5 square. So there is no bishop c6, knight e5 coming. Let's say king e2, keeping the king in the center, connecting the rooks. e6, opening the path for the bishop on f8. Let's say rook h c1, all normal moves by white, taking control over the only open file. Bishop d6, developing and threatening also to expand in the center with e5. Bishop c3, taking control over the e5 square, and now knight a5. And now we see the problem with putting the bishop on b5. After bishop d7, queen d7, king d7, black still continues with his plan of landing a knight on c4. So b5, knight c4, maybe b4, and so on. So this doesn't solve actually white's problems. Of course, it's equal. Of course, it should be draw. I keep repeating this, but that doesn't make it devoid of play. And as we will see, the stronger player tends to outplay weaker opposition, even in these equal and you could even argue drawn positions, because of the higher quality of the moves. So that's, for example, sample line after bishop b5 by white. It was also possible to put the bishop on d3 with the idea to, instead of castling, to play the move king e2 and then play rook hc1 as he did in the game, but just keeping the king in the center rather than putting it on the king side. And the third option that we have in this position is that actually a move that was played in modern times, in the 20th century, by very strong players. In fact, one world champion, Anatoly Karpov, and the other strong grandmaster was actually his second, Vladimir Yapishin. Both of them reaching this position, but from another move order. They played the move knight e5. And this is by far the most concrete move here in the position, making it apparent of the difference in approach to these problems in the 20th century in modern chess. So you see, it's a very concrete move, immediately addressing the issue of black's idea, long-term plan of knight a5 and so on, and by introducing some exchanges. And after knight e5, d5, e6, yeah, we have a position, an endgame, which is approximately equal. And both games were actually drawn, the games being Karpov-Chernin in 1992 and Yapishin-Halifman from 1996. So you see how modern grandmasters very concretely, very, very exactly approach these problems. They tend to play much less vaguely than the masters of the past, and this is one of those evolution of chess as a game. So let's go back to the position after bishop d7 and continue with the game. Janovsky playing bishop e2, e6. Capablanca continues development. e6, opening the dark squared bishop. Short castle. Again, fine, and besides, white's decision to castle was made with his previous move, bishop e2. If he wanted to leave the king in the center, he could have played bishop d3 and king e2, but he decides to castle short. But then again, slight feeling that gives you, okay, but it's an endgame, why not just leave the king in the center? Again, nothing wrong, but slowly, a little by little, these things tend to accumulate. So bishop d6. So opposed to his opponent, Capablanca leaves the e7 square for the king, and he intends to keep the king in the center. So by playing bishop d6, he also takes control over the e5 square. So rook fc1, taking control over the open file. King e7, centralizing the king, connecting the rooks, everything normal. Yeah, and now we are start of this. We entered the endgame very early on move 6, but this is like the middle game of the endgame, if you wish. So here both sides have mobilized their pieces, and now, even though black's plan is kind of clear, what he wants to do, it is white's task that it's the more difficult one, because he has no clear plan. He is anticipating this plan of knight f5, b5 and so on, but he has no active plan himself. Yeah? And again, this aspect of whose position is easier to play is a major factor in the game of chess, when two humans are playing. So in this position, Janovsky played the move bishop c3. And again, he's solid. He connects the pawn structure, but also he introduces a threat with this move bishop c3. Can you see, for example, what his idea here is, what he wants to do? And if you see it, then think of how Capablanca dealt with this, with White's idea. So in this position, after bishop c3, White's threat is actually to land the knight on e5 by playing knight e5. He needs the bishop on c3 to have control over the e5 square, so as in order not to lose a pawn, just putting the knight there before that. So the threat being knight e5, and now Capablanca's way of dealing with it is a move that you would again say, oh, but it's a natural move. You play this anyway. It's a move that based on general considerations. Of course, it can be made. The move is rook hc8. Yeah, but it's not just a move based on general considerations, which are of course fighting for the open c file, putting rook on an open file. It is also a prophylactic move because now White's knight e5 can be met by simply bishop e8, removing the bishop from the d7 square, and then that knight can be chased away with f6. Yeah. And if, let's say, knight takes c6, then bc6 and c5, and black can still continue by playing in the center. Yeah. So again, it's a natural move. You can easily just go over it if you just briefly look at this game without too much consideration. But the important thing is, again, as I keep stressing, is that these natural, normal-looking moves very often contain other ideas. And to understand these ideas, you have to delve a little bit more deeply under the surface. So rook fc8 actually prophylaxis against knight e5, apart from being a normal move you would make anyway. And in this position, Janovsky played the move a3. Yeah. It appears strange because it weakens the b3 square, yeah, and also the c4 square. So b3 now controlling the c4 square is not really possible. But on the other hand, long term, I think this move could not have been avoided because once black plays b5, knight a5, b5, there would be a threat of b4. Yeah, and then let's put the knight on a5, yeah, something like this, and then b5, b4. Yeah, hitting that bishop on b3 and gaining space on the queen side. So what Janovsky does is he ensures against this threat of b5, b4 by controlling the b4 square, and he plans to deal with these weaknesses of the light squares by putting the knight on d2, as we shall see, and the knight will control both b3 and not c3 but c4. Yeah. So this is how he intends to deal with black's plan of queenside expansion. So of course Capablanca continues with his plan. Everything is ready. He is fully developed. He goes knight a5. Yeah? The threat is now knight b3 to win the exchange, of course, forking both rooks. And we also noted how White planned to deal with this threat. He goes knight d2, yeah, covering the b3 square. And in fact, the move is not just a defensive one. In fact, the move also has an active idea in mind. So can you see it? Can you see what, if given a move, what White would play next in this position? So if you were vigilant and if you already trained your mind to look for the opponent's active ideas, you would notice that the knight on d2 also controls the e4 square. And in fact, there is a threat of playing e4. So to illustrate the point, let's just say that black misses the idea and continues with his plan. Yeah, so he goes b5, right? It's part of the plan, right? b5, knight c4, and so on. But now after e4, White obtains great activity in the center. And now if black is greedy and goes after material, after d takes e4, it's better to go bishop f4 or king e8, which would keep the position equal. But principally, black wants to take advantage of the weakness of the light squares on the queen side. So let's see what happens. D takes e4, knight takes e4, knight b3. So it appears that black is winning the exchange and winning the game, yeah? But in fact, White's activity here is very, very strong, very big, you could, yeah. And he manages to not only just to save the exchange, but actually obtain a winning position with the series of forcing moves. So first knight takes d6, king takes d6, bishop b4 check. So the king is, you see, short of squares, it's forced to go forward. King d5, bishop f3, king d4, centralized king, but not so happy being open in the center. Rook takes c8, bishop c8, unfortunately it's forced because taking with the rook c8 after rook d1, check, leads to the loss of the bishop on d7. So bishop takes c8, rook d1 check, anyway, king e5 and rook d8. Yeah, and the end of this forcing line leads to a winning position for black because black is devastated by this pin along the 8th rank. So this illustrative line shows the dangers that black can face if he just neglects the possible opening of the game. So therefore, when we go back to the move knight d2, and we understand that the threat is e4, we can also understand black's next move, which is the move f5. So basically Capablanca prevents white's idea of e4 by taking control over the e4 square. So again, a prophylactic move by Capablanca. And now an interesting moment again where what I mentioned a bit earlier about the quality of moves and the clarity of moves. So what white does next is a rather vague move and a move that he could have done without. So he plays the move g3. Okay, not the move that first comes to mind. Again, it has the vague idea of let's say shutting the h2 b8 diagonal for that bishop on d6, but that is not really relevant in this position because if he wanted to play f3 as he did on the next move, he could have played f3 immediately. He does not need g3 for the next move f3. Yeah, so again, it's a vague move. It's a move that is not of very good quality, and like I said, these things tend to pile up. Here, for example, white had a chance to be more incisive, to be more concrete in his approach, and he could have played a move like f4, yeah, which locks in the center, and he has the idea of getting the knight to e5. Yeah, of course he will deal with the threat of knight b3 first. So let's say f4, locking in the center, and after normal looking moves like b5, black continues with his plan of landing a knight on c4, king f2, centralizing the king, knight c4, and now there is no threat of knight b3, and white can use that to get his own knight on a dominant position on e5. So knight f3. And then we have knight e5 next. For example, bishop e8, removing the bishop from a possible attack, knight e5. And now both knights are very strong. Yeah, and the position is equal. And more importantly, white does not really have problems to solve. Yeah, because he has own knight to compensate for black's strong knight on c4. And again, with a really comfortable position for white, and then really no pressure or feeling of inferiority. But white did not go for this. Yeah, so after f5, going back to the position after f5, he plays g3. Like I said, just a strange move, difficult to explain, and move that also shows some psychology of the player playing with white, that he is not probably feeling comfortable in the position, and shows that he's not clear on what he needs to do in the position. He doesn't have a clear-cut plan, doesn't really know what to do, and just plays a move just for this because he needs to make a move. Yeah, it's a game of chess. You make moves alternatively. Yeah. So again, this is something that tells you something about your opponent when you play a game. Capablanca, on the other side, he continues with his plan. He goes b5. Yeah. So again, I said, notice the difference of the approach. Black is playing moves that are easily understandable. They are clear. He's following his plan. whereas white is playing strange moves like g3, and now again on the next move a move like f3. So not very clear cut, and not really dealing with the essence of the position, which is the essence being that white is under some pressure, and he's well advised to deal with that pressure if he can. And in fact, here we arrive at the moment where white should have felt that things are slowly becoming uncomfortable, and he should have stopped and thought maybe a bit more deeply, calculated some lines to try to kill off the position. I spoke about this approach in one of the earlier videos, where this is characteristic of modern grandmasters, for example, that in a position where they sense that things are slowly going not their way, they look for forcing ways to kill off the position, either by, like I said, transposing to a safe position, to an easily drawn position, to a theoretically drawn position, or something that kills off any play in the position. And in fact, white could have done this in this situation. So again, maybe pause a little bit, think of a forcing variation that white could have embarked on, and which would have solved his problems in this position. So if you looked at it, you normally look for these solutions by looking at forcing moves. Yeah? And the forcing move in this position is chopping off that knight. In a way, you could argue that it's also a prophylactic move, because black wanted to use that knight to jump to c4, and white is using prophylaxis by eliminating that knight. So after bishop takes a5, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, rook takes a5, knight b3 is the idea of all this operation. Rook drops back to a8, a7, doesn't matter, and knight c5. And now you see that the pair of bishops that black has is not of great help, because of that knight, dominating knight on c5 really ensures white against any problems. Yeah? So instead of black having a great knight on c4, it is white who ends up having a great knight on c5, and this just eliminates this feeling of discomfort by defending a slightly inferior position for a very long time. Here white is feeling freely, he has a good knight on c5, all his remaining pieces are good, well positioned, so nothing really to worry about. So again, a missed opportunity for the white player to stop at the very beginning this long process of having to defend a slightly inferior position. So going back to the position after b5, like Janovsky misses this chance, and he plays a move, another strange looking move, the move f3. Like I said, if he wanted to play f3, he could have played f3 without playing g3 first. It would have saved him a tempo. So f3, g3, okay, Capablanca continues with his plan, knight c4, just landing the knight on the ideal square and hitting that pawn on e3 in the process. And here, I think a possible explanation for the move f3 is that perhaps Janovsky intended to follow up with king f2, defending that pawn on e3, and maybe he missed that here black has the nice tactical possibility of playing b4. Yeah. So again, white shouldn't really panic. Maybe he did panic and played the game move bishop takes c4. The point being that after b4, black manages to penetrate to c2 with the rook. And for example, a sample line is, and white's best attempt here is the move knight c4, just to show you the best play by both sides. So knight takes c4, b takes c3, knight takes d6, c takes b2, knight takes c8 check, rook takes c8, rook cb1. The rook must remain on the first rank, so to that after black promotes b takes a1 queen, rook takes a1. he's able to recapture that queen, and now rook c2. We notice that this appears unpleasant for white, unpleasant for white, but he should be able to somehow hold it. Yeah. Again, not very pleasant, but this was already a result of his previous imprecise moves, and yet on the other side, you could understand that white didn't really, maybe he wasn't calculating very sharply, maybe he did not see this line, maybe he was looking the other lines that white could play, and he saw problems there. So again, it's a situation where he already has to calculate concretely to stay out of trouble, and okay, he failed to do so. So after knight c4, what he did was he chopped off that knight on c4 with his bishop. It's worth noting that taking with the knight is worse, because knight takes c4, b takes c4. Black has the plan of putting a bishop on a4, activating it first before executing b5, b4 with this very straightforward and clear-cut plan of advancing on the queen side. So to avoid that, after knight takes knight c4, white took with the bishop, bishop takes c4, and after b takes c4, the pawn structure transforms, and now there are no more doubled pawns. In fact, that doubled pawn became a very strong pawn on c4. And now in this pawn structure, black has the really easy, straightforward plan of just pushing b5, b4. But before doing that, by taking that knight on c4 with the bishop, white plays what he prepared with this f3 move, and that is the advance in the center with e4. And now we come to another very instructive moment in this game, and something, I think, a moment which is quite deep and maybe even impossible for a player to understand during a game. After all, Capablanca failed because, like I said, I think it was required very deep introspection in the position to understand what needs to be played next. First of all, let's see what does white want to do here. Actually, what I was just explaining pertains to the next important moment in the game. Here, actually, it's simpler and perhaps more surprising that Capablanca failed to play the best move. And if we ask ourselves, what does white want to do here after playing e4? The question being, does he want to advance? Does he want to take? Or he wants to keep the tension? Yeah. And we will quickly see that and understand that basically white has this really clear-cut plan of again landing a knight on e5. And in fact, what surprises me is that Capablanca missed this plan by playing the move king f7. Yeah? It liberates the e7 square for the bishop. So after e5, bishop e7, the bishop is really well placed on e7, supporting play on both wings. But that was not what white should have done. Yeah, perhaps both players missed it. I find it difficult to explain. He should have played the move g5. Now, why g5? Okay, let me first explain what both players missed, and then we understand the move g5. Yeah. So, but after king f7, white should have taken on an f5, e takes f5, e takes f5, and play the move f4. And now the knight is happily hopping to e5 with absolutely no problems for white whatsoever. With that strong knight on e5, he's super happy and all his problems are solved. So again, I find it difficult to understand how both players missed this really straightforward and easy way for white to solve all the problems. So now if you go back to the position after e4, now we understand why the move g5 is important. Because it prevents the move f4. So now after e5, there is no f4 because both the pawn on g5 and the bishop on d6 control that square. And now if white plays e5, then yes, black needs to put the bishop on c7 rather than on e7, but this doesn't really mean much because in a closed position he can easily reroute that bishop, king f7, bishop d8, and the bishop can come to this diagonal. Yeah, and of course the game continues with black having again the possibility to play on both wings. So g5 would have been the correct prophylactic move here. So again, a rare case of Capablanca missing to see his opponent's or what should have been his opponent's main idea. Because again, surprisingly, after king f7, white played this very, very big mistake of playing e5. We mentioned ef5 followed by f4, knight f3 was the best way. Because after e5, bishop e7, now we have this position where black is basically dominating because he can play on both wings. Yeah, that is also the name of the chapter. Yeah, play on both sides of the board or play on two weaknesses. So he can play on the queen side with b5, b4, and he can also expand on the king side by g5 and so on. Yeah. So Janovsky continues with f4, advancing, connecting his pawn structure, and this is the moment where I got a bit confused a bit earlier on. This is the moment where very instructive moment, because on one side we see Capablanca use the method he basically used automatically in all his games in similar situations, and this method is he's more active. I will explain it now. He's more active on the queen side. So first he maximizes his position on the side where he's more active, so on the queen side. So he is expanding there, b5, doubling on the a file and so on, threatening b4. So he's basically trying to win on the side where he stands better, which is the queen side, by pushing through b4. And once this is prevented, he switches flanks and goes to play on the other side of the board by playing on the king side with g5. So the method normally works. Yeah? The method works, and the method is something that you should be aware of and you should try to implement it in your own games. But here actually we have an exception to that method, and again I can't blame Capablanca or anybody for not realizing that here we have an exception to the method. And here in fact the exception being that he should have started play on the king side rather than on the queen side. So he should have started here with the move g5. And the point of the move is that we will see later how white could have taken advantage of black not starting play on the king side, because for the time being white is not yet ready on the king side with king f2 and moving the knight or putting the rook on the open g file. Yeah? So here already the threat is to take on f4, gf, gf, and take the open file with rook g8, rook g5, rook g4, and so on. And in case of taking on g5, f takes g5, bishop takes g5, king f2, intending the regrouping that was possible in the game with rook g1 and knight f3. In this exact situation, this is not possible because that pawn is still on b7 and not on b5 as in the game, and black has the move bishop a4. Why is this so important? Well, simply because it wants to activate the bishop via the c2 square, and this forces the rook to stay on c1 and the knight being pinned on d2. If white decides to move the rook from c1, then that would allow bishop c2, and the bishop transforms from being a bad bishop to being a monster bishop on c2 or d3 or e4 or wherever black decides to position it. So this is a concrete line showing the advantage of starting with g5. But the theoretical aspect of why in this case we had an exception was that starting play on the king side would prevent white from activating his king side and being able to deal with that king side play when it happens later in the game. So going back to the position after f4, I explained why here starting play on the king side first was more important, but nevertheless let's follow the method. Yeah, let's follow Capablanca's thinking, Capablanca's manner of play, because we also learn from that as well. Even when it's not ideal, we also learn why. Yeah, and also we learn to see how that method is employed, and in this case how it could have been countered. So b5, like I said, normal, natural, following the method of expanding on the side where you have the advantage. King f2. Now white is already improving his position on the king side, and now that idea of putting rook on g1 already works. So for example, if black now starts to play on the king side, it's one move too late. So let's say g5, f takes g5, bishop takes g5, and rook g1. Yeah, and now the knight is free to come to f3 and chase away that bishop, and black does not have the idea of bishop a4 because he blocked that diagonal himself by putting a pawn on b5. But of course that was not Capablanca's plan. After king f2, he did not want to mix left-right that quickly by switching flanks, but he simply wanted to continue with piling up on the queen side, so he went rook a4. The idea is, of course, to double on the a file and then execute the b4 push. If allowed, this would win the game for black, because after a b4, bishop b4, the pawn on b2 will be exposed, and it will be a weakness. So king e3, white centralized the king, rook c a8, Capablanca continues with his plan. Again, the method, like I said, just with the determination, with the clear-cut moves and logic, he continues playing and following his plan. So the threat is b4 because the rook on a1 is not defended, making the pawn on a3 pinned. So white must remove the rook from a1 by playing rook b1. Here we come to a position which is actually the maximum black could achieve on the queen side. But as it happens, white's defense on the queen side is quite strong. And now logical for his queenside action would have been to continue. Yeah? So he prepared everything so that he pushes b4. But the problem is that after b4, a takes b4, bishop b4, white has the move b3, and he gets rid of that pawn on the queen side he will exchange on c4, or after cb3, knight b3. All the pawns on the queen side will be exchanged, and white won't have any weaknesses there. And this would mean that, okay, black loses his advantage. Therefore, realizing that even though he maximized his position on the queen side, he cannot break through there, Capablanca does, again, something very characteristic, something very typical, and that is switching flanks. So again, like I said, the chapter is called Play on Two Weaknesses, but also can be called Play on Two Sides of the Board. So stand still on the queen side, he switches side and starts play on the king side. So he starts with the move h6. Now you would argue, okay, why h6? Why not g5 immediately? Well, the problem with g5 immediately is that after knight f3, g takes f4, g takes f4, rook g8, taking over the open file, white is also ready to counter on the open file by playing rook g1. And again, black gains nothing here from this premature, as it happens, opening of the king side. And that is why, after rook a b1, Capablanca is actually patient and starts with h6. So he's preparing g5, but not playing it just yet. Yeah, because as we saw, playing it just yet, playing it immediately gives nothing. So knight f3, played by Janovsky, g5, Capablanca now continues to expand, the point being that after he wanted to be able to take on g5 with the pawn. And perhaps this was what perhaps made Janovsky not consider, or we don't know why, the capture on g5. In fact, now again we have a position where, just like on move 18, if you remember that bishop a5 move that was a forcing line that could have solved his problems. Now we come to a situation where white again has a pretty straightforward and clear-cut forcing variation that would have solved his problems. But yeah, Janovsky misses it again. Perhaps you want to test yourself. Maybe you can pause the video and think a little bit how white can actually solve his problems and stop feeling inferior and under pressure in this position. So okay, if you do so, do so now. Okay, if you looked at it, we can see that in this position, white could have in fact taken on g5. F takes g5. The idea of h6 was, of course, to take with the pawn, so h takes g5, and now h4 is the very important move. And now black faces a somewhat unpleasant choice, because what does he do? If he pushes g4, then after knight g1, the knight is happily hopping to e2 and f4, and you never win this game position for black. Knight on f4, protected passed pawn, everything is closed down, you don't win. Yeah? So g4 just gives free access to white to the f4 square. Alternatively, he can take on h4, g takes h4, g takes h4, and fight for the open g file, rook g8. But after rook g1, rook a8, still trying to, after rook g8, to recapture rook g8 and fight for the open g file. White now has the chance of playing bishop b4, using the fact that the rook on a4 no longer controls that b4 square. And what white does actually here is he's finally getting rid of that bad bishop on c3, and he wants to exchange it for black's good bishop on e7. And all of a sudden, here, as strange as it may sound, black is in fact in some trouble, because after the exchange of dark squared bishops, we will have a typical good knight bad bishop scenario, with white having access to all the dark squares, king f4, knight g5, and so on, without the dark squared bishops, of course. Yeah. So again, you see sudden transformation if just black follows straightforwardly with this idea of playing on the king side. So that basically means that the move f takes g5 followed by h4 would have solved white's problems. So going back to the position after g5, to conclude the explanation about fg5 and h4, now we can see the importance of that exception to the rule, to Capablanca's method, and why it was important to start kingside play before white is consolidated. Because here you can see white is consolidated, king on e3, knight on f3, the rook can access the g file and everything. So the kingside play does not have that effect. Yeah. Whereas had he started it immediately instead of playing b5 but starting with g5, black would have increased his chances of success. So again, that's why I say it's I think unfair to criticize Capablanca for not going for his usual method, which usually works, and understanding that this is an exception to it, because as you can see, it's very, very deep, and this line is just an illustration, why it's so difficult to grasp that in that particular moment. But Janowski missed it too. Again, he's missing these moments where he can kill the game off, where he can solve his problems, and this makes it only more difficult later on. So normally, when you have these situations and such development in a game, where you're feeling that you're slowly getting outplayed or you're slowly getting into some inferior position, try to use the first opportunity to kill it off, to calculate your way out of trouble. Because then it gets more and more difficult. And you will see, for example, the last moment when Janowski could have done that to calculate his way out of trouble, the line was extremely difficult and not surprising that he missed it. So in this position, he goes for the move knight e1. Knight e1. He wants to rearrange his pieces. The knight from e1 can go to g2 and cover f4 and also cover h4, which we will see will be important once black's rook gets to g4 and then rook h4 is not possible. Again, makes sense. It's part of the plan, but it's not best because there was a forcing solution here. So rook g8. Capablanca continues this switching of flanks. Immediately opening the g file with g takes f4, g takes f4, rook g8 brings little because the knight comes back to f3 and allows for rook g1. And even though this is white loses a tempo, he's still fine in controlling black's activity on the g file. So since this immediate opening does not bring much, after knight e1, Capablanca starts with rook g8. So he's keeping the tension. He's waiting for the best possible moment to open the file, because now he's basically, as it's called, controlling the levers on the king side. White cannot and will not take, because of course if g5, bishop g5 drops the exchange on c1. So when you have, it's a general rule that when it is you who controls the possible exchange of pawns, you should keep the tension and release it in the most appropriate moment. And this is what Capablanca does. White cannot take, so he's taking his time to use the to take on f4 in the moment which gives him the best chances. So king f3 in this position played by Janowski. It was okay, somewhat strange, because he could have played knight g2 as he planned, yeah. But king f3, difficult to say. It does liberate the e3 square for the knight, so knight g2 or knight c2, knight e3 is possible. But he could have started perhaps with knight g2 first, and then maybe he won't need the move king e3, especially as starting with knight g2 prevents black's gf4, because then white would recapture with the knight. Whereas now Capablanca uses the fact that white must take with a pawn, and he already has a rook on the open g file, so he uses this moment to take on f4. Again, this game, why I find this game so deep is that because in these moments where Capablanca was following his usual method, like maximizing and then going for the next step, like here, for example, in this case, he maximized on the king side, he put the rook on g8. Now is the exact moment when after gf4 he controls the g file, so white cannot oppose on it. So he uses the exact moment to do it. Again, objectively speaking, turns out to be not the best situation. So we have a lot of these exceptions to his method, and that's why I think it makes it so instructive. Yeah? In a way, you see how he uses the method, which, like I said, works in, I don't know, maybe 80-90% of the cases. But by having these exceptions, you realize that, okay, sometimes, well, chess is a game that's, well, there are a lot of exceptions to most rules and methods. But still, by noticing the exceptions, you learn also the method, how he does it. So here, again, white cannot oppose on the g file. He already has a rook there, so he opens the file in this exact moment. So g takes f4 and rook a8. Yeah? So he's ready now to double. Rook goes to g4, the other rook to g8, and he's completing this transition of switching the flanks. Okay, he maximized, if you remember, on the queen side, got there to a standstill, started playing on the other side of the board. Now he's making progress there and switching sides. And here Janowski continues with his plan, the plan being of getting the knight to g2 or e3. But in fact, his move is a mistake. He should have started, he played the move knight g2, yeah? But he should have started from the other side, knight c2. The point being that after rook g4, rook g1, rook a g8, he gets to exchange one pair of rooks, and this eases his defense. After rook takes g4, rook takes g4, knight e3, hitting that rook on g4, rook h4, king g3, for example, white is completely safe. The key of the position is that without two rooks, black does not have enough firepower to put pressure on both sides of the wing. He cannot so easily switch sides. Yeah? And this makes it safe for white. So after rook a8, playing knight g2 is not that good, because black gets to keep both rooks on the board. So he continues with rook g4. Again, some improvement, like move like, let's say, bishop e8 with the idea of king f8, bishop h5. It's just not Capablanca style. Okay, he's playing naturally, he's playing normally, he's playing forward moving chess, he's playing smoothly. This looks just too unnatural to put a bishop on e8 to break this harmony of the connection of the rooks and introduce these ideas which are not connected to his previous play. And his previous play was to switch sides, double on the open g file. So rook ga4, and now rook g1, another I would say difficult move to understand, because white is self-pinning him on the g file, again, maybe he thought that he can build a fortress there with the rook g1 and then bishop e1, bishop g3, and just solidify everything on the king side. But this, unfortunately, is not really going to work. It was actually better to play a move like rook h1. Yeah? The idea being that now he wants to go knight e3, attacking the rook on g4, and then the rook goes to h4. There is no attack on h2 because the rook on h1 is defending that pawn. And after doubling on the g file, yeah, the rook g8, knight e3, the rook is chased away from g4. Going to h4, as I explained, brings nothing because the rook prophylactically defended h2 in advance. So rook 4 g7, and now bishop b4. Yeah, we saw this idea in one of the previous lines. The bishop is activated thanks to the fact that black no longer controls the b4 square twice. And after something like the bishop d8, move like king f2, intending rook g1 to exchange one pair of rooks. And it's clear that white has improved his position, and he has good chances to survive. So again, we see a situation, okay, going back to the position after rook g4, again we see a situation where white's quality of moves is inferior. On each move he has a better opportunity, better chance, but he's playing actually something worse, and his position becomes more and more difficult. Yeah, still not lost, but more and more difficult. So rook g1, rook a8, this is natural, Capablanca follows his plan, and bishop e1 by Janowski. So again, this is his plan, what he envisioned. He wants to put a bishop on g3, plug the king side, and hope that this would render black's doubling on the g file useless. And now again, very instructive moment. Again, very instructive from the aspect of Capablanca's method, yeah, which of this, how he played on both sides of the board. So you notice the moment. Notice white's last move. White's last move put a piece between the rooks. So it introduces some lack of harmony in white's position. It is part of the plan to get the bishop to the king side, yeah, but it also introduces some lack of harmony in white's position. And it also intends to deal with black's switching of flanks, which was doubling on the g file. So in this exact moment, where white is switching, also trying to defend against black's attack on the king side, this is the exact moment when Capablanca switches flanks again, and he plays the move b4. Yeah, so you see the moment when white is almost there to plug the holes and defend, he's switching again. And the idea of the move b4 is to activate the bad bishop. So the idea is to open the a4 e8 diagonal so that black can play bishop a4, bishop c2, and bishop e4. If he is allowed to do this, he would, of course, be winning, because the bishop will become a monster on e4. And then probably, as we will see actually, this will lead to material losses for white. So again, this is so typical of the method, so it's very much worth noting. But again, we have the last exception here. Objectively, this allows white to save the game. But again, first of all, the way to save the game was very, very difficult, as we will see. And second, try to put yourself in one of the player's shoes, okay? If you look at it from black's side, he was putting pressure from the get-go, okay? The moment the queens were exchanged, he had this clear-cut plan, he was implementing it, he was improving on the queen side. He met a standstill. He moved to the king side. He improved there. White is preventing it. He's striking again on the queen side. He's activating the bishop. So for the whole game, he's in charge. He's putting pressure. He has the initiative. So from Black's aspect, this is upward trend all the time. Now put yourself in White's shoes. He's suffering. Okay, he had these opportunities to kill off the game. He missed them. So he's or didn't see them. Yeah? And all the time he's under this constant pressure. Yeah, always solving problems, always on the defensive. Yeah, and how is he to know that this move gives him an unexpected chance? After suffering and defending for the whole game, this is not an exercise. Yeah, now okay, I can make it an exercise for you and tell you, okay, how does White save the game from here? But even that will be extremely difficult. So this is not an exercise for him, and he's suffering all the time. He's defending, and it's not surprising that he misses it. But this only makes my point from before even more important, and that is that you should take the first opportunity to kill off the problems, to solve the problems, not the last one, because this is the last one, and it's not surprising he misses it because it's first of all of the accumulated pressure throughout the game, suffering and defending, and second because the last one is the most difficult one. It just is such a game that if you miss your opportunities, every next one is more and more difficult. So that's why you should try, if you can, use the first one, because the first one is the easiest one. Yeah? And we saw it here in this game. He could have taken on a5, he could have taken on g5. Yeah, these were much easier to solve his problems. He could have taken on f5 as well, e5, e5, f4, and the knight transfer. He missed all these, which were much easier. And now we have the last one, which you will see how difficult it is. Yeah. So again, very instructive moment from all these aspects that I explained. So b4. Yeah. Again, speaking objectively, he should have gone bishop e8, king f8, bishop h5 to continue playing slowly. But again, this was not Capablanca's manner of play. Yeah. So it's understandable. So b4. A takes b4. Taking with the bishop would have been met with the same bishop a4 and then bishop c2. White takes with the a pawn so that he opens the a file and he can use it to activate his rook. Capablanca follows his plan bishop a4. And Janovski also activates his rook with rook a1. What Capablanca wrote about this game, he mentioned the move rook c1 here, which prevents bishop c2. But then after the simple rook b8, now you see play has switched again. Now we're switching back to the queen side. Rook b8 followed by bishop takes b4 will eventually expose this pawn on b2. Therefore, Capablanca played Janovski played the right move, bishop rook a1. Capablanca continued with his idea bishop c2, and it appears it's game over. Yeah, bishop comes to e4, everything falls apart. Yeah, the knight on g2 is lost and so on. But this is the exact moment where White actually could have saved the game. And if you want to test yourself at this difficult task, be my guest. Take some time, calculate some lines if you can. And then see if you can be better than Janovski. So, how could White save here? Well, he could have saved the game by sacrificing a piece actually. He should have played rook a7 here. The point being that after bishop e4, king e3, Black cannot conveniently take the piece because rook g2, rook g2, rook g2 allows bishop h4. Yeah, the rook is no longer in g4 to control the h4 square, and the bishop on e7 being pinned by that move rook a7 makes sure that White regains the piece. Going back to the position after king e3, if Black takes with the bishop, bishop takes g2, the key move here for White is the move b5. And as strange as it may seem, the threats of bishop b4, again attacking the pinned bishop on e7, followed by b, and also the threats of b6, b7, advancing the pawn. In fact, surprisingly, give White enough counterplay not to lose the game. But again, look at this. This is like very, very difficult. maybe even impossible to find. Yeah, maybe as an exercise, you give this as an exercise to a strong player and he finds it. Yeah, but during a game, how was he to know that there was a saving resource in that position? Yeah, so again, can't blame the players for missing this difficult escape for white. So going back to the position after bishop c2, again, not surprising that Janovsky followed with his plan of bishop g3, but unfortunately this loses. After bishop b4, now we have this complete transformation of the awful bishop on d7, bad bishop on d7, to a wonderful one on e4. After king f2, h5 is the decisive factor. White cannot stop h4, and he is doomed because of that pin on the g file. Yeah, and the rest is, well, okay, pretty elementary because black wins material. So rook a7 already, it's too late. Bishop takes g2, rook takes g2 and h4. And again, it's about the pin. Yeah, white loses material. Bishop takes h4. White is trying his last chance, but it's just easily diffused. This feeble counter attack on against that bishop on e7. So rook g2 check, king f3, rook h2, attacking the bishop on h4, and also threatening rook h3. Bishop takes e7, rook h3 check, king f2 and rook b3. Okay, elementary technique. Rook comes behind the pawn, so preventing any advance, and also threatening rook b2, and then when he will have also his own passed pawn. Bishop g5 check, blocking the g file, but this is temporary. Rook king g6, rook e7, attacking the pawn on e6, rook b2 check, king f3, and now rook a8. And you see now white's king is going to be mated. So after rook e6, king h7, there is really no defense against the rook a3 mating idea. So for example, in this position, okay, white resigned, but just to illustrate that, for example, something like rook e7 check, king g8, the threat is still mate on a3, and after king g3, rook a3 check, king h4, rook h2, we have a mate. So in the position after king h7, white resigned. So in the final position, again, we see triumph of black's switching of flanks. Eventually, again, he breaks through the queen side. Yeah. So again, very, very deep, very complicated game. Game full of nuances, game full of very instructive points and moments, which I hope I managed to convey and explain. A game that for me personally was very eye-opening, not only because of the depth of the resources that both sides had, but in fact for the aspect that following the Capablanca's method and the exceptions when he was applying that method, every time being actually the exception to the rule, made it so clear to me how that method is actually employed. Yeah. So he was employing it every time. Actually, he should have done something else, but by noting the difference, it made me understand how that method actually works in practice. Yeah. And I can assure you that exceptions to the method are much less frequent than actually employing the method. So of this switching of flanks and building up play and so on. So I hope you enjoyed this video analysis. I hope you learned. I hope I managed to convey this knowledge that I gained from my own analysis of this game. And thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next game. Hello, and welcome to the video analysis of the game Capablanca Marshall. The position we have in front of us is just completely winning for white, right? He's a pawn up. He has a better pawn structure, dominant bishop. What more can you ask for? So the reason I chose this game is because, again, I find it very typical of how Capablanca converted his advantages, even in completely winning, let's say, positions like this one. So if you look at the position and you see, okay, white is a pawn up, he has this 3 against these 2, A, B, C against A and D on the queen side. So natural and normal would be to just start advancing where you would, right? So something like, let's say, bishop f3, keeping the bishop on the long diagonal and where he's expected to advance. And at the same time attacking the pawn on d6, so rook b6, defending that pawn, rook fd1, attacking the pawn on d6 one more time, rook d8, defending it, a4, and then continue a5, b4, and so on. Yeah? Of course, this would have won the game, right? But what Capablanca does actually is he plays something else. He does not immediately start playing on the queen side. He notices that his opponent's king side is somewhat exposed, and he starts attacking on that side, on the king side, trying to obtain advantage there. And this is this principle of two weaknesses, because you can say that Black's first weakness is his queen side, where he's a pawn down, so he needs to defend on that side of the board. Yeah. So apart from d6 being weak and so on, but he needs to defend there. And normally when you attack only on one wing, the opponent is normally capable of defending there. Yeah, because he's concentrating all his pieces on that side of the board, defending stubbornly, and he manages to defend. And therefore the method of winning in such situations is to switch the flanks and create a second weakness on the other side of the board. So actually what Capablanca does here is that he immediately starts creating a weakness on the other side of the board by attacking that exposed king side by Black. Yeah? So again, I find this very, very instructive, very telling of Capablanca's manner in such situations. He already has this advantage on one side of the board. He is a pawn up there already. And yes, he could have advanced and then switched sides, but no, he uses this exact moment to switch sides by a swift attack on the king side, also at the same time using the fact that his pieces have better mobility. So he actually starts with bishop c4, not bishop f3, but bishop c4, keeping the bishop looking towards the king side. Yeah. He attacks the pawn on d6. So Marshall defends with rook b6. Now rook e1, threatening rook e7. And then the bishop on c4 really comes in handy by pinning Black down to the defense of the f7 pawn. King f6, preventing rook e7, and now f4. Here we start the attack. Yeah? White now wants to take on g5, use the f-file, rook f1, and also attack that pawn on g5 after f takes g5, h takes g5. So knight e6, attacking the rook on d4 and the pawn on f4, therefore forcing f takes g5, big check, h takes g5, and rook f1, another check. And now Black is faced with a difficult choice. Where does he put the king? Does he keep it close to the d6 pawn by putting it on e7? Or does he keep it closer to the king side by playing king g7? Difficult choice, yeah, and not a very happy one. Marshall chose to keep the king in the center by playing king e7. And in case of king g7, yeah, White's best is rook d5, yeah, keeping an eye on that pawn on g5, and also intending to switch sides again by playing rook a5 and attacking the pawn on a7. Once the rook comes to a5, the threat will not only be taking on a7, but the threat will also be bishop takes e6, and then the rook from a5 can capture that pawn on g5, because the bishop e6 would eliminate the defender of the pawn. So again, we see this switching of sides in this variation as well, combining the attack on both sides of the board. So after rook f1 on move 29, Black plays king e7. Okay, and now Capablanca plays rook g4. The immediate threat is to take on e6 and take on g5, winning a second pawn. Notice how from the start, which is like already 5 moves ago, every move that Capablanca played contained a threat. So every move is very concrete. Every move contains a direct threat, an immediate threat. And forces black to defend all the time. And this is a pretty straightforward way to play, and a very difficult style to play against, because you're always feeling under pressure. You always have to defend something. You always have to be careful about something. So the pawn on g5 is hanging, rook g8, Marshall is defending it, rook f5. Again, the same threat, take on e6, take on g5. Yeah. Rook c6, Marshall is trying to defend in an indirect way because he pins the bishop on c4, because now bishop e6, if the bishop moves, the rook after the exchange on e6 and let's say taking on g5, black will be able to take on c2. So the pawn on c2 is hanging. So since he cannot take that pawn on g5 by eliminating the defender on the knight on e6, Capablanca uses the h-pawn and plays h4. So h4 attacking the pawn on g5 one more time. And now again, now it's very problematic for black how to deal with this threat of losing another pawn. In fact, he decided to abandon it because he can no longer defend it. A move like f6 would defend the pawn on g5, but it would lose a piece after bishop d5, attacking that rook on c6, and after the next rook e4, the pinned knight on e6 will be lost. So a simple one move variation, not too difficult to see that after h4, white wins the second pawn. So rook g c8 and h takes g5. And therefore you see Capablanca won a second pawn. And what I find always impressive when looking at Capablanca's games is that they always feel somehow forced. You know, he attacks, the opponent must defend. He attacks this, the opponent must defend. He tries this, the opponent must do this. He tries that, the opponent must do that. And it feels like it's a forcing variation. You know, and this is like really impressive. It is still impressive to me to see that it is possible to play chess like this. And in fact, chess on very high levels really feels like a very forcing game, because in a position where to let's say a club player, it appears that there are many possibilities, that there are many things are possible. For the strong grandmaster, there are very few. And these few can be controlled, can be calculated, and therefore it feels very forcing, very, very controlled, very concrete. Yeah? So this is the difference in levels. For the let's say the amateur player, like I said, can mean that okay, anything is possible. But for the grandmaster, very few things are possible. And this is this feeling of forced play that actually implies that plays of actually very high level. So, winning a second pawn, Marshall continues with rook c5, and now a moment where Capablanca like to convert advantages in this way, and I mentioned also in the other videos that he liked to exchange pieces in order to move forward. Okay, because by exchanging pieces, you see you're moving the game towards its completion. So the less pieces are on board, the closer the game is to its finish, whichever the finish will be, of course. Here, of course, the finish will be a white win. But by exchanging pieces, he's getting the game closer to completion. And like I said, he wanted to exchange pieces to move the game forward. Yeah. So he embarks on the exchange of a couple of pieces. First, the light pieces. Bishop takes e6. F takes e6. Now exchange of rooks. Rook takes e5. Rook takes e5 and g6. So what he did was he transposed to a rook endgame. And, you know, I'm pretty sure you know the aphorism that all rook endgames are drawn, but that aphorism should be continued, in fact, with the words except those that are not. And here, and sometimes transposing to rook endgame is actually the easiest way to win, and the simplest in a way. And here we have such a case. The point is that, apart from white being 2 pawns up, he can easily continue switching sides and thus win in a relatively simple and easy manner. Now, you see the white's rook is behind the passed pawn. So even though the pawn will not promote because the king is close enough to block it, he uses the g pawn, the g6 pawn, to force the black king to move to the king side. And then once the king is there, he switches sides again to the queen side, which is, will be left undefended. So king f8, and now the key move, rook c4. So not rook a4 because that just achieves nothing, let's say something like a5 but rook c4. What Capablanca does is, first of all, he offers the exchange of rooks, which would lead to a winning pawn endgame. Yeah, I think it's, if you're not sure about this pawn endgame, I think this is a good opportunity for you to analyze it yourself. What happens after rook takes c4, bc4, and let's say king g7. Yeah, so I think you can and you should analyze yourself, because I think you will learn a lot by checking it yourself how to win this with white. I can just tell you the basic plan, which is, of course, to use the king and the g pawn to advance, and then at the appropriate moment to play the move c5, which would disrupt this pawn pair, either by, most likely, black will be forced to take because otherwise the pawn runs, and then the white's king will be able to come to e5 to take that pawn on e6, recapture the other pawns as well, during which time black is occupied by taking care of the passed pawn on the g file. So this is just the scenario how this pawn endgame is won. And like I said, if you're not sure, please invest the time to make the moves and analyze yourself, because I think you will learn from that analysis. So realizing that the pawn endgame is lost for black, black is now forced to move the rook, and then white can use the open c file to attack either the pawns on the 6th rank by rook c6, or the pawn on the 7th rank, the pawn on a7, and this in particular, when the king comes to g7, will be quite important, because then that rook c7 attack will come with a check. So rook c4, he must avoid the exchange, so rook a5, a4, of course white will not give up his a pawn, a4, king g7, black needs to get the king there to deal with his passed pawn, and now rook c6. And now one of these pawns on the 6th rank will fall, or in case black decides to defend it, like he did in the game, rook d5, now he loses the pawn on a7 after rook c7 check. And now we see the importance of this, of the rook being on the c file actually. Rook c7 check, and then he picks up the pawn on a7. So king g6, rook a7. Yeah. So white is again 2 pawns up, and okay, the game continues. Okay, black will not resign, and nowadays you should not even expect that your opponent will resign in losing positions. Under the influence of the world champion, we've had increase in resistance, if you will, and players tend to play on for a very long time in losing positions, sometimes bordering on insulting, but let's not go into that. So rook a7, the position is winning, but the game goes on, and what is important is that you shouldn't lose nerves when your opponent is not resigning. Yeah, when he drags the game on and on. Alekhine used to say, technique is good nerves. Yeah, so you should be calm, you should be patient. Yeah, you know you're winning, take your time, wrap it up, don't get upset, play the best moves, and then win. Even if it takes 20 moves more. For example, like in this position, you wouldn't expect that the game would last for 20 moves more, but if your opponent drags it out, you shouldn't be bothered that the game continues for longer than expected. After all, a point is a point, irrelevant if you win in 20 or 80 moves. So rook d1 check for black, king h2, of course not king f2, because that allows rook d2 check, and then white loses the pawn on c2. No need to give away pawns. So king h2, therefore d5 and a5. Now the plan is simple, the pawns simply go forward. Rook c1, and now rook c7. It's possible to give up a pawn and push a6 and win and so on, but Capablanca was not, that was not his way of winning such positions. So he's just defending his pawn on c2, and now he intends to just keep on pushing a6, a7, and then the b pawn can join and so on with a straightforward win. So rook a1, preventing a6, b4, defending the pawn on a5, rook a4, and now I think the instructive moment in this game. What Capablanca does now is that he allows his opponent to get one pawn back, but he transforms the position to a one that is an elementary win. And this method of giving some material back in order to transpose or transform the position to a one that you can, it's an elementary win, one that you can win, I don't know, being woken up at 3 a.m. in the morning with eyes closed, is a very good and efficient way of converting an advantage. So sometimes you don't need to cling on to your material advantage. Sometimes it's most practical to give up some of your material, sometimes even all of your material, so that you transpose to a position that you know in your sleep that it's winning or easily winning, and you know how to win it. And this just removes all doubt in your mind. Yes, it's winning, but I need to calculate, should I go this way, should I go that way? It clears the doubts, and it's just ends the game for you. Okay, you know this is winning, and that's it. Yeah. And what Capablanca does in this position is exactly that. He plays the move c3, which at first sight appears like a logical. It defends the pawn on d4, b4, sorry, but it allows this trick of d4. The point being that if c takes d4, rook b4, and then the pawns are disconnected, and things can become a bit tricky. But in fact, he foresaw this, and he played rook c6, attacking the pawn on e6 and threatening a6, b5, and so on. And after d takes c3, rook takes c3, rook takes b4, black did recover one pawn, and a weaker player might even panic here. Oh, but I lost one pawn, just 2 against 1. Oh, did I mess up or something? But Capablanca, of course, had everything under control because he foresaw that with his next move, rook a3, is what makes this position elementary. For a second time in the game, he puts a rook behind the passed pawn. The first time was on the g file, if you remember. And this time he forces the black rook to come in front of the pawn, which is the worst position for a rook in a rook endgame. So he makes black's rook completely passive, and then he can use that passivity to advance with his king and his passed g pawn. Yeah? So this is what makes it like really easy and elementary for him. So rook b7, a6, rook a7, yeah? And now again an important move, rook a5. So he cuts off black's king along the 5th rank. King f6, g4. Again, if we start from the beginning, he's again switching sides. So he got maximum on the queen side. He maximized the position. The rook cannot move, yeah, because the threat of the pawn advancing is fatal. And now, since he achieved maximum on the queen side, he's switching again to the king side, where he uses his trump, which is the passed g pawn. So king e7, king g3. And now, again, a curious case which we saw in more than one game, king centralization. So normally we want to, the rule is, okay, you centralize your king in the endgame. But look, he's centralizing the king on move 53, having played for a very long time without the centralized king. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't centralize your king in the endgame, but what this means that you should always consider what is more important. Is it so it's said that, okay, the king centralization is never wrong in the endgame, but it can be inappropriate. It can be played in an inappropriate moment. So the timing is important for king centralization. So in this game, for example, you saw the game was pretty dynamic, even for an endgame. A lot of things were happening, so there was no time for white to centralize the king. So it was something concrete happening, yeah, and more important. And only now, yeah, when things have stabilized, basically, white uses the king to support the advance of his g pawn. So king d6, king f4, going forward, king c7, king e5, attacking the pawn on e6, king d7. Of course, going to b6 is just useless. Yeah, because after moving the rook, black can never take the pawn on a6 because the g pawn will promote. So that is why after king e5, black defends the pawn with king d7, but now the g pawn advances g5. So again, this is I say elementary win because the pawn advances, and if the king goes over to stop it to the king side, then white uses the king to go to the other side and attack the rook on a7, and then the a pawn will promote. So one of the pawns will promote. So king e7, g6, king f8, king e6 taking the pawn, king e8, and now the final move of the game. Moves of the game, g7. So again, switching sides. First king side, queen side, king side, queen side. We had a lot of them in this game. The pawn is sacrificed to remove the blockade from in front of the a pawn. So g7, the threat is g8, rook takes g7, a7, rook g6, king f5, and the rook is the pawn is promoting, and Marshall finally resigned. So not a difficult game for Capablanca, but again I think a game that is less known, but one again which I found instructive, especially in the beginning when he could have played in the, let's say, expected way by advancing where he was a pawn up, but instead he chose to attack the other side of the board first and obtain advantages there before going back to the side where he already had an advantage of being a pawn up. So thanks for watching this video. I hope it was instructive, and well, I'll see you in the next game. Hello and welcome to the video analysis of the game Fendrich Kaufmann versus Capablanca and Reti. Now, immediately the name of the game is a bit surprising, because in fact this was a consultation game played in pairs, which were quite popular back in those days. Nowadays this has transformed to hand and brain and these kind of things that we do today. But in this game played in Vienna, in Reti's own words, he was basically just an observer of Capablanca's genius. He wrote that he was just basically following Capablanca's process and his thoughts, and he basically let the Cuban play alone. And in fact, the way this endgame was conducted is quite typical of Capablanca's style, and therefore I have no reason to doubt Reti's words. And what is also interesting is that in his book My Chess Career, Capablanca wrote that this endgame was one of the best endgames he has played ever. So let's check why he thought so. So it's black to move here, and the position is obviously to his advantage, because these doubled pawns on the h file, h2, h3, practically mean that black is a pawn up, because he has this passed f pawn, while white cannot do anything with his pawns on the h file. He also has a very strong dominating bishop on e4. But on the other hand, if we look at the position, white has a really good square for the knight on d4. And if he manages to establish some sort of blockade on d4 and f4, he may hope to hold the position. So the fight here will be to get black's f-pawn moving forward and prevent white from establishing blockade on the dark squares. So how does Capablanca go about that? He starts with rook b6. So immediately he starts playing on the queen side. So yes, he should try to push the f-pawn, but he plays on both sides of the board. So he wants to create a weakness on the queen side. So first he's attacking the pawn on b2. Apart from attacking the pawn on b2, the move is also a prophylactic one. So I guess by now you're not surprised when I mentioned that normal looking moves are also prophylactic ones, because what he's trying to do is he wants to provoke the movement of the b pawn, and with this he prevents white from attacking his own queenside by means of rook b3. Yeah. Or rook a3, depending, yeah, if the move from a8 moves. So b3, and now rook c8. Again, you would say, okay, normal, natural move, yeah, attacking the pawn on c2 and so on. But again, it's a prophylactic move, yeah. And if you can guess what it prevents, that's, well, congratulations to you. And in fact, it prevents the move rook c3, activating white's rook. Yeah, so then maybe it can come to c7 and so on. So by attacking the pawn on c2, black is also preventing white's rook c3. So knight d4 is forced, defending the pawn on c2. And now, after having provoked this weakness of on the queen side, okay, b3, kind of now white's structure lacks flexibility, and having prevented white from activating his rook on the queen side, Capablanca switches the flank again. So the rook on b6 has nothing more to do. So he switches it to f6 and now threatens f4. He also uses the moment when the knight left e2. Yeah. Sorry, f3. The knight left f3, and now he wants to take advantage of the fact that the pawn can move forward. So the threat is f4. And in fact, in this position, white sort of succumbs to the insinuation, if you will, that black is threatening f4. Yeah. In fact, what he does is natural. He blockades the pawn, plays rook f4, and at first sight it appears that he achieves good blockade because he manages to establish two pieces on the blockading squares of d4 and f4. But in fact, this allows black to kind of gain tempi attacking these blockading pieces. So what he should have done actually is that he should have prevented the black king from entering the game with the move rook g3, cutting off the king along the g file and preventing it from entering the game. This does allow the advance of the f pawn, but what white should have seen is that after f4, he can play rook g4, attacking the pawn on f4 twice, and after f3, he can drop back to g3, attacking the pawn on f3 3 times this time. And this attack limits black's movements, black's freedom of maneuver. And at the same time, he still is playing without a king on h7. So this would have given white higher chances of holding the endgame. But after rook f6 is in the game, again, it's difficult to criticize because rook f4 looks like such a solid move, keeping the blockade, and it appears that white is doing all right. Yeah, he blockaded the pawns on the dark squares. It appears that the light squared bishop can do nothing about it, and well, he seems to be okay. However, the rook on f4 is not very stable. Yeah? So Capablanca's next move immediately addresses that issue. So king g6, intending king g5, attacking that rook on f4. A good alternative here actually was the move b5, yeah? Which, as we will see, this idea is later used in the game b5 to fix that pawn on a2, and with the idea of rook a6 and targeting it directly. So there is no a4 defending move. So that was a good alternative. But Capablanca's move is also natural, king g6. He wants to go king g5 and attack that rook on f4. And now white misses a good chance to put stiffer resistance. He plays c3, which again makes sense. It removes the pawn from the attacked square on c2. Black couldn't really take that because after the exchange of the light square of the light pieces, the rook on the e file could be activated with rook e7 and so on. So it makes sense to remove that pawn from c2 and just in case, yeah, and put it on c3 from where it solidifies the knight on d4. It's safely defended by the rook on e3. But this allows black to continue with his plan of breaking down the blockade on the dark squares. So what white should have done, in fact, was to play king, first to play rook g3, check, preventing king g5, and after king f7 to play c3 now. Yeah? And this is a better version. This is a better version simply because it prevents king g5. And then a logical plan for black is to get the king to e5 instead, but that forces him to sacrifice a pawn. And yes, it still gives him an advantage, so king e7, rook g7 check, king d6, rook b7, a6 first, yeah? And then king e5, and managing to break the blockade, and also don't forget that the pawn on c3 is hanging. So this gives, of course, black an advantage, but okay, at least white has a pawn now, yeah? So he can resist. Instead, after king g6, he played c3 immediately and allowed king g5. Yeah? Maybe he hoped that after knight e2, everything is safely defended, right? So the knight on e2 is defending the rook on f4, so there is strong blockade. d4 is strongly also defended. The knight on e2 also defends the pawn on c3 one more time. So it appears that white is holding, yeah? And this is, again, the exact moment when, having maximized the position on the king side, he tried to break through, putting a rook on f6, king on g5, wanting to break through with f4. White stopped it, and I'm pretty sure by now you know what happens. The exact moment when switching sides happens. So playing on two weaknesses, switching the attack from the king side now to the queen side, which has been relatively abandoned. Rook a6. So the pawn on a2 is hanging. So white plays h4 check first, but this is an obvious move that is bad because it only helps the king to the center where it wants to go, king f6 and then king e5. The king is much better placed on e5 than on g5, obviously, it's centralized. So it was better to play a4 immediately, even though after rook b6, black should still win, because this pawn is attacked. And white cannot go knight d4 because the king is attacking the rook on f4. So maybe that was the reason why white wanted to play h4 first, forcing king f6. So now the rook is not hanging on f4, and now a4. And now maybe he was hoping that after rook b6, knight d4, he can somehow hold. Yeah, but in fact, and hoping for the trick. Yeah, for example, king e5 here, which would be awful because of rook f5. Yeah, because the bishop is pinned, so black loses a pawn, and this is obviously horrible for him. But, and in a way, it's some defense for white. But in fact, here black needs only one more patient move, which is the move rook f8, threatening king e5, as now rook f5 is no longer a threat, as black defends that pawn with the rook from f8. And again, black wins without too much trouble because white is overstretched. The knight must stay on d4 to defend b3, and he cannot keep the blockade on the f4 square. But after a4, Capablanca found actually an even more forcing way to win the game. Like I said, rook b6 was possible, but he found an even better and more forcing, more aggressive way to convert, which is the move b5. So he's sacrificing a pawn to activate his rook. Yeah? So he's breaking through now on the queen side. So a takes b5, rook a1 check. Yeah? And now white has a choice whether to go rook f1 or king f2. In the game he played king rook f1, and after king f2, again it's an illustrative line to show the domination of black's pieces. King e5, attacking the rook on f4, rook f3, rook a2, pinning the knight, yeah, king f1, getting away from the pin, and now rook g8. Yeah, and now even just visually it's clear that black is winning. He's attacking from all sides. The threat is to go rook a1 check, and if, for example, if king f2, then go rook h1, attack this pawn on h2. So you see he's attacking from all sides. The rook on the g file from the king side, the rook on the a file from the queen side. The king is centralized, the bishop is centralized. There is always a threat of f4 at some point. So white's position is collapsing. Therefore, in the position after rook a1 check, white played rook f1, but after rook takes f1, king takes f1, king e5, black finally wins the battle for the blockade. In fact, he breaks down the blockade and finally takes control over the f4 square, and now the f-pawn can march forward. Note that white's extra pawn means nothing, because these three pawns, b3, c3, and b5, cannot move forward or create any passed pawn. So they are basically useless, and what counts here is black's activity and ability to penetrate with his pieces using also his passed pawn. So knight d4, white of course still tries to resist, but this is of course just temporary. f4, finally moving forward and signaling the triumph of black's strategy. Rook h3, rook must stay on the third rank in order to defend the pawn on c3, and now rook g8, threatening bishop g2, winning the rook. Notice how, and I keep stressing this, every move that Capablanca plays is very concrete, very exact, containing a clear idea and clear threat. Yeah. So this is very important. Whenever you can, you should try to play in this manner, so that your moves are clear, first of all, to yourself. Yeah. Why you're playing them, and hopefully they should also contain an idea or a threat that is relevant for the position. So king e1, escaping the bishop g2 check, rook g1 check. Now black wants to have the rook on the second rank, but he does it not immediately with rook g2, but he uses he achieves that by with tempo. So rook g1 check, king e2, rook g2 check, king f1. Yeah, so black got the rook on the second rank, and now rook b2. The threat is again bishop g2, again king e1. So black improved the position. He had the rook on g8, now he has a rook on b2, which is obviously much better placed. He's targeting this b3 pawn, so the knight cannot move, the pawn on h2, but he still needs to wrap it up. And the next move is kind of nice, because you would be looking at some concrete variations here. Should I push f3? Should I play something else? Yeah. But what Capablanca does is a move played on domination, which is also a very nice theme that is present in many games of many players throughout history, Capablanca's too, which is the move h5. So you see, it's a move that just shows the complete domination that black has in this position. The point is, of course, to limit the movement of that rook on h3 and prevent white's h5, which would allow for maybe some knight rook h4 activation. But by playing this h5, white is now almost in a Zugzwang. So what can he move? Yeah, he cannot move basically a single piece. So he goes for king d1, maybe king c1, attacking the rook, but okay, he must make a move. Yeah. And now the second instructive moment, how to convert. Yeah. And Capablanca actually sees that here again, as for example in the game with Marshall, transposing to a rook endgame is the fastest way to win. So why is this? Well, if you look at it, his main advantage is the passed f-pawn. But the pawn can't just cross f3 just yet, because white is controlling that square with two pieces, the knight on d4 and the rook on h3. But if he exchanged the knight, which is after all white's best piece, centralized knight controlling f3, defending b3, then black can use the greater mobility of his king and his rook to force through the passage of the f-pawn. So bishop f5. And note that he uses exactly this moment when white put the king on d1 to play bishop f5, forcing white to take, because moving away from h3 to f3, the only available square, is not possible because bishop g4 pins and wins the rook. So he uses the exact moment when the move achieves maximum effect. So bishop f5, knight takes f5, king takes f5. And now, again, the win is elementary because king e4, f3 is happening, and white just cannot coordinate his pieces. The king on d1, the rook on h3, they cannot coordinate and mount defense. So white tried c4, and for example, in his book, as I mentioned, My Chess Career, Capablanca analyzed this game, and he gave the following line. Again, it's a good illustrative line to show what he saw during the game. If white tries to activate the rook with rook d3, black continues with king e4, of course threatening f3, f2, f1, rook d4 check, king e3, rook d5, and f3. So black sacrificed the second pawn. He's 2 pawns down, but he's winning because of the quality of the pieces left on the board. White's 2 pawns are completely irrelevant, and black's sole passed pawn is decisive and will cost white the rook. So rook e5 check, king f4, rook e7, f2, rook f7, king e3, and Capablanca noted that white will be forced to give up the rook for the passed pawn. So the immediate threat is, of course, rook b1 check and f1, and in one order or the other, and white is losing a rook. So in the game after king f5, white tried c4, but now king e4 again. The threat is f3, f2, and it's so bad for white that he has no time to take on d5 or push c5, because f3, f2 literally will mate white, because once the pawn lands on f2, the king cannot approach, and the next move is f1 with queening. And if after f3 white approaches with king e1, then king e3 happens with the mate looming on b1 with the rook. So rook c3, getting the rook out of prison, but f3 again with the same idea. King e1, so now there is no king e3 as it was possible with the rook on h3, but now d4. And now black obtains a second passed pawn. White here resigned, because after rook c1, d3, the pawns are just rolling. d2 is the immediate threat, check, and then if king e3, f2, or rook h2, and just everything falls apart. Yeah. So white resigned, and well, probably congratulated both opponents, even though, as we mentioned, it was probably Capablanca playing this game. So to conclude, I would say it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that this was one of Capablanca's best games, best end games, as he wrote, but still a very instructive one, in a way that he to grasp and understand his manner of playing the endgame. Yeah. So this switching of sides and playing on two weaknesses, provoking weaknesses of one wing, then switching to the other one, trying to progress there. When white prevented that, switching again to the queen side. And this is this typical method of playing on two weaknesses, which is very effective, because at some point the defending side is simply unable to get in time with defense on both sides of the wing. So the side who is trying to win can switch as many times as he finds appropriate, and at one point the defending side won't be able to catch up with the defense and he will crack. So again, thank you for watching this video. I hope it was enjoyable and instructive, and yeah, thanks, and see you in the next video.